right, cool. Hi, everybody. I am Magos. This evening, I am going to be doing a brief overview and an installation of OPNSense, which is a free-to-use open source firewall tool that is really awesome and that I use at home in my own home lab. So we're going to start off by just building up a new virtual machine. I'm using VMware, but for those using VirtualBox, much of this stuff is still going to be the same. I'm doing a custom setup because there's some fun things we need to set up that are different from a normal VM. Just going through here, selecting that it's going to be based on FreeBSD. I'm going to name this OPNSense. Allocated some resources. So the minimum specs recommended by the people at OPNSense is going to be a 1.5 gigahertz multi-core CPU, 8 gigs of RAM, and 120 gigabyte SSD. You don't need to allocate that much RAM, and certainly not that much storage for what we're going to be doing tonight. But if you are planning to use this in some real capacity, you're going to want to make sure that you have hardware up to the task. So I'm going to allocate mine 16 gigs. So my primary network connection, I'm going to use a bridged network. All the standard defaults here. Create a new virtual disk. I'm personally going to allocate it 50 gigs. You don't need to. It could probably run on 20 just fine. That's fine. And now here's where we're going to have the fun part. I'm going to go into customize hardware. And you're going to see that we have the one network adapter that we set up in bridged mode. I'm going to add another network adapter here. And that network adapter I'm going to set up to be in a virtual network that I choose. Remember whichever one that you choose, because you're going to need it for another client later to access the web GUI. Now, the reason we have two network adapters is this is simulating edge device that you're using as a firewall. And so you'd have one incoming from the internet, whatever you're using, whether it's a fiber connection, cable modem, etc., and then whatever's going to your switch or downstream devices. I'm going to go ahead and throw in the ISO for OPNSense. Finish. And boot it up. Let it go through its auto boot cycle. And this will take a couple minutes. While we're waiting, we're going to talk about what OPNSense is. So OPNSense started as a fork of PFSense, which is a fairly popular open source firewall tool. One of the reasons that I have selected to use OPNSense over PFSense is while both run on FreeBSD as their backbone, OPNSense is currently using version 13.1, while the current community release of PFSense is on FreeBSD 12.3. Now, what that makes a difference is when it comes to hardware compatibility. So I have recently in my home lab or in my home network gone to 10 gig Ethernet, and FreeBSD in 13.1 offers support and drivers for a lot more 10 gig NICs that are available than the older version of FreeBSD that PFSense uses. So that was a primary driving factor for me to transition from PFSense to OPNSense. That is likely to change in the near future because PFSense Plus, which is their commercial version, their industry-supported version of PFSense, was just released using FreeBSD 14, which means that their community edition is going to be released using that sometime in the near future. Whether OPNSense gets ahead of them again or not is yet to be seen, but that's kind of one of the fun things that you have to deal with when you're looking at open source stuff is who has the latest and greatest cool thing, especially when both are in the same market and when one is a fork of the other. As you can see on the screen here, it's just going ahead and auto-configuring the interfaces. It asked us a while back if we wanted to set them up manually. I just let it do its thing automatically. All right. So once you get into the login screen, right now you are essentially running off of a live disk. So if you were to have stuck a USB into a machine, you're running a live image off the USB. To actually install it into the hardware, which is what we're going to do, we're going to use the installer login, which is going to be installer. Enter. Password is OPNSense, all lowercase, OPNSENSE. Enter. And give you all your normal setup stuff. We're pretty much going to keep it all at the defaults, except for this. I like ZFS, not UFS. So we're going to do that. You can absolutely set this up in a RAID. For this, I'm not going to because it's a virtual machine. Spacebar to select yes. And yes, write it. And it's going to build. So, OPNSense. Well, I mean, why use any free open source firewall system? The simple answer is because it's better than what comes on most SOHO routers. So whether it's OpenWRT, etc., it's both PFSense and OPNSense are much, much, much more capable than those systems, and they're scalable. So you can install it on a system like I have, which is eBay server called the Hive Zeus that has a bunch of horsepower behind it that allows me to run, a 10 gig network and a whole bunch of plugins and additional operations that are somewhat hardware intensive. So, as this goes, anybody have any issues or questions yet?
Can you drop a link to that hardware you're using?
Yeah, absolutely. For that.
ZFS versus UFS? Or sorry, was somebody else talking? I might have not heard you.
So Wearlock asked me to drop a link to the Hive Zeus. I can probably not give you a link right now, but I can definitely type in what it is so you can just eBay it and find it yourself.
Okay. Just so I get the spelling right.
Yeah. So the Hive Zeus is actually a pretty cool system. It's a whole bunch of like a big giant data center. Got rid of their old, 8 to 10-year-old hardware, but it's all high-end hardware. Like mine is dual E5 2680 V2, 64 gigs of RAM, and a 10G base T NIC, and I got it for $150. Good luck finding that anywhere else. Okay, so we have set up our OPNSense system. It's nearly complete. At this point, we can choose to change our root password. I'm going to go ahead and bypass that for now and let it reboot. And then Sponger, was you asking UFS versus ZFS?
Yeah, sorry to interrupt, Barlock. I didn't hear you.
Happens all the time.
But yeah, John, it was just curious about UFS versus ZFS. What's the differences between those?
Different file structures. So how the file structures work on the system. It's a doctoral length thesis on both themselves. But essentially, ZFS allows you a lot more flexibility than UFS does. That's kind of how I'll leave it for this context, if that's all right.
Sure. Yeah, I can go do some Google searching too. Wasn't sure if there was like a specific benefit of, or if it's just like personal preference. But yeah,
It's a bit of personal preference for sure, but that's just because when you start going into very large data file structures, you start getting into flexibility of what you can do, and ZFS offers a lot more options than UFS. And something like this, honestly, it probably doesn't matter. It just was kind of ingrained in my head that if you have the option, use something better, and ZFS is generally better than UFS.
sounds good. Thanks.
And it's doing its auto configuring again. Everybody's systems sort of keeping up.
Yes,
If
sir.
you're Following along? All right, cool. And here we are. So for this login screen, we're going to go ahead and use a default login because I didn't change the root password. And that is going to be root. And the password is going to be the same as before, all lowercase, OPNSense. And it'll take us to this interface. All right, so what we can do now is we're going to assign our interfaces. Go press 1 key, lags, we go ahead, no, VLANs, no, and assign the WAN interface. In this case, for me, it's going to be EM0, and assign the LAN interface EM1. No optionals, proceed, yes. And this is taking longer than average. Means it got angry. All right, wonderful. Well, we'll let that figure it out. For anybody else who's running along, has that original login screen that showed your IPs at the top shown up yet?
Not yet for me. It's same screen that you got.
Okay. All right. Well, in the interest of time, come on. Now I go to a clone that I've previously built. I'll make sure all this is the same. Yes. I'm going to power this off. If you guys continue having issues and it doesn't load and I get way too far ahead of you, please let me know. But I don't want to just be sitting here on a screen trying to figure itself out. Sweet. And here we are. So if that had previously worked the way it's supposed to, you will eventually get to this screen where it'll show you both your LAN IP and your WAN IP. Now, in a real world situation, your WAN, if you're using this as an edge device, would be whatever your publicly assigned IP it is. This is behind yet another firewall that I'm using at home on my network. So that's its assigned address. And then the one that we need is going to be this LAN address, 192.168.1.1. In another client that, very importantly, is attached to that same custom virtual network that we had previously. Go ahead and fire this up. Open up a browser. and go to that IP address. Advance, accept. Enter our same username and password. So that's root and OPNSense, all lowercase OPNSENSE, and log in. And that takes us to our dashboard. You're going to start off with a wizard, kind of guiding you through the initial system configuration. You can change this to whatever you like. If you want to change the host name, go ahead. You can update your DNS servers. So let's call Cloudflare home. Have it not be overridden by whatever my ISP wants it to be. And we can leave this normal for now. Set your time zone and where you want to get that network time from. You can go ahead and set up IPv4 configuration, whether if you have a static or what have you. In my case, it's DHCP. If you want to spoof a MAC address or assign a MAC address, you can absolutely here. But generally speaking, we don't really need to do anything on this screen. Go ahead and click Next. LAN IP address, that's fine. And if you want to change your root password, you can do so here. I personally am not going to, because one of the first things I'm going to do after I update is disable the root account and create a new user. Okay. So once we're through that, we're going to get to our dashboard. Now the dashboard is where you're going to start up every time you access this page outside of the first time. And it shows you some information about what system you're using, what kind of connections you have, what your IP addresses are, usage, etc., services running. It's really customizable. You can change it however you want to. A lot of the stuff I don't need, but stuff I like to look at is like my traffic graph and let's say a firewall log. And I can just add those by adding widgets. Bring it up here. I can drag this over here, have it however I want it set up. Minimize these, close that. Set up in whatever way makes you happy. Next, you have license information. So as you can see, it's free, totally open source based on its license. If you ever want to change your password, you can do it from right there. Log out right there. Reporting. As this lives and has uptime, you'll start accruing data. You can enable a whole bunch of different statistics, traffic data statistics, general logging statistics. In system, you have a whole bunch of just your system settings. So the next thing I like to do, we're going to go back to lobby to the dashboard. You'll see I have this wonderful thing here. Click to check for updates. I'm going to check for updates. It says there are some updates. And the cool thing about this is it always gives you nice in detail update list of everything that's in every patch. So if there's some stuff that you don't want to break or you have some custom service running, the fact that it actually lists out exactly what every change is every time it updates is something that I personally appreciate. Scroll the bottom, let it update. Any issues or questions?
Oh, just enjoying watching this get done since I've never set up a PFSense or OPNSense box, to be honest. So I'm taking some notes.
That's pretty straightforward. The difficult part comes in when you start setting up things like high availability, or you want to set up a software-defined wide area network, or all your VLAN and firewall rules, but that's all very particular to your individual conditions. So
I did like how you could just move around those like blocks of things. I was like, well, that's fancy. That's definitely not in the old stuff.
yep. So as you can see, it's rebooted, so it's going to ask me to log back in. And I'm going to go back a little bit ahead to firmware updates. It's still updating. But yeah, it's extremely customizable. If you've ever used PFSense before, their GUI is significantly different. Most are it uses vertical drop downs versus horizontal selection. And another turn of personal preference, I much prefer this GUI over PFSense. You can delete. There we go. So it's rebooted, fully updated, and I can't type. All right. So the first thing that I like to do on pretty much every system where it default login by root is change that. So you're going to go to System, Access, Users. You see we have the root user as the only one. I'm going to add a new user. I'm going to create myself. I'm going to create a highly complex password. I don't need any of this other information except for group membership. So I'm going to add myself as an admin. You can absolutely set up more complex security rules like certificate logins, etc. And you can use this. You can use these SEM certificates if you set up a certificate authority for VLANs or excuse me, VPNs rather. But that's a completely different talk for the future. Save and go back. We're going to log out. Log in is that new user. Go back in to access, users, root, edit, disable. Go away. Save and go back. So, no more root, because root and just having it available, especially if you're using the default password, just in general, I don't like it. It makes me feel yucky on the inside.
You mean you don't like having admin as the password?
I mean, why not? I mean, like, listen, like root, or like, yeah, perfect. That's the greatest way to do things. Optimal security. Yeah, always test in production. Yeah, exactly. Okay, so in access, as of right now, there are only two, or a single group, and that's the admin group. Now, if you're in a production environment and you need to have people with different levels of access, here is where you could do it in the groups section by adding, and you can go in to configure it however you want to with what permissions they specifically have. If you have multiple servers running this, you can do that. Forgot what that does. Configuration, establishing backups, backup history, update history. This is where we were before with firmware and status. So this will tell you all your version information, what mirror you're currently using to update, when you last updated it, the settings if you want to change which mirror you use, etc. Complete change log. This is the update screen we were on before. And here we get into some of the fun and cool things that you can do with OPNSense, and these two new ones are plugins and packages. So plugins and packages are essentially all of the add-on tools that the open source community has created for OPNSense to increase its power and utilization. So whether you wanted to create a dynamic DNS client or utilize radius authentication for access within your network, or basic things, collecting hardware diagnostics, or some of the more cool stuff that I like to do, like using WireGuard as opposed to OpenVPN for my VPN services, or super cool things like using ZeroTool as a software-defined WAN agent. There's a whole mess of stuff that you can add on to just the base software of OPNSense through all of these plugins and packages. And because we are like super cool hacker types, I immediately need to change the theme because this white drives me up the wall. So I'm going to find this OS theme rebellion, which is apparently suitably dark, and go ahead and just install it. Says it's done installing. I'll go to my settings, general, theme, rebellion. Save. Much better. I can actually look at my screen again. And a lot of these plugins and packages are what I would like to talk about in future talks about OPNSense, because there's a lot of very cool stuff that you can do. But for tonight, I'm just going to go ahead and go through some of the basic things that you can do on the base software itself. So moving on, if you want to set up specific gateways, high availability, if there's specific routing tables that you want to utilize, you can set all of that up. There's a wizard. If you want to set up assignments, so if you establish VLANs and they're separate interfaces, or you have your VPN interfaces, you can do all of that type of things here. Firewall rules, fairly straightforward. This is a firewall OS after all, so setting up all of your specific firewall rules. As a default, within the LAN, OPNSense says LAN traffic is completely open, but WAN traffic rejects all incoming requests. That's just its default rules off the bat, which is reasonably okay. I don't want anything outside coming in. Depending upon your use case scenario, you're probably going to want to set up a whole bunch of additional rules in here. Traffic shaping is something that you can do. There's a whole bunch of diagnostics that you can do. If you want to set up a VPN, the two that it supports natively are IPsec and OpenVPN, which are OpenVPN is super common. As I stated previously, I prefer to use WireGuard, but that's just, it's generally much faster, and there's some other cool things that it can do. All of the services currently running, so your DHCP services, if you want to set up a captive portal for your network, you absolutely can do that. It does offer some basic intrusion detection stuff, which is very cool, but also extremely hardware intensive, as you can imagine. So as we set this up in the future, our hardware requirements will probably increase. Setting up DNS web proxy stuff, and then you're at the end. And that pretty much is it for tonight as a basic overview of setting up OPNSense, getting it running, and set up for future modification in future talks. Any questions?
Yeah, Magos, I actually have a question for you.
Send it.
So with the different packages that you can add, as far as like security goes, because I don't know, one of the things that I think of is like WordPress servers. Like, WordPress is it's somewhat secure until you start adding all the different packages and things like that. Are these like pretty much kept up to date fairly often? Do they automatically update on the back end when you do add these?
Correct. Yes.
Nice.
So yeah. So these are all very much kept up to date. A lot of these are directly linked to the actual source. So like if I would just glib is updated on its whatever it's hosted on, generally speaking, it'll automatically update here. Now, if there is something that you've installed and like it's hosted on OPNSense's backend server, as soon as it gets updated on the backend server, this will update as well. And it will update, like your running version will update if you tell it to update. Now, that's a very clear thing, again, is you have to make sure that you tell it to update. Because as we know, if there are some updates that could be done on stuff that breaks things. So you have to kind of play adult rules of like, yes, this service has been updated. It will tell you it has been updated if you go into firmware updates. It'll show like, hey, this one package, is going to be affected and has an update, but you have to tell it to do it. That makes sense.
Yeah. So it's more of like a manual process. You can maybe set like a cron job to like check for
Yes,
updates on like
Hu-
Saturday night or
hun-
something like that.
100%. You can set up cron jobs for auto updates, etc. Whatever
Nice.
you'd like to do. That is absolutely possible and has built-in tools to do exactly that. Um, but again, if you're running this in a production environment, you don't want OS theme Rebellion 1.8.9 to take down your whole network, which is why it doesn't just automatically do it. So, any other questions?
I had a question.
Send it.
Earlier you mentioned disabling root and switching to a normal Windows
Yes.
user. And before that, we were talking about how OpenSense and like PFSense is used in like a small business sort of environment as well.
Yes,
With that
absolutely.
in mind, like if we create a new user, do you know if they provide any additional sort of features like 2FA or something that we might be able
Yeah,
to enable?
absolutely. So you can definitely use certificate login. And actually, I'm almost certain there is a package that you can download that will require multi-factor authentication for login. So,
Gotcha. Perfect. Thank you.
I just see OTP seed. Does that generate the actual OTP token?
Yep.
Or, well, like the seed for the token?
let's see. I've never used it before.
Check that box. Let's see what happens.
Yep. Save. Oh, well, I created a new user. Hold on. Edit.
Oh,
Yep.
nice.
There you go.
Very cool.
That is cool. Thank you.
Anything else?
Yeah. Could you show us the DHCP portion of this?
What specifically?
Oh, just want to see, kind of it comparative to PFSense. Just looking at
Yeah. So here is, for instance, the DHCP v4 server for the LAN. And it's very similar to PFSense in terms of what options you have. You can define a gateway or whatever DNS servers you want to utilize if you have a separate DNS. All almost identical to the options you have in PFSense.
Okay. Hey, say I have an incident that happened and I'm
Mhm.
looking for someone changed like a name of a device I have, say in my home network,
Mhm.
and I want to cruise like the logs. Where would the logs be for this OpenSense?
Depends on what exactly you are using. So majority of logs you're going to find under system and log files. So that'll be all your audit backend, boot, general, GUI logs. So if you had audit, obviously there's not going to be anything here because we just set this up. We'll have boot logs.
Right. Awesome. Well, that's
But
what I wanted
those,
to see.
yep, these are where all your stuff is going to be.
Cool.
And
Thank
you can, and there are tools, and you can also you can set this up to auto export to something like a different appliance, like Waza, for example. And there's other plugins that you can use as well.
Nice. Cool, man. Thank you.
Yep.
Hey, Magos, I got a quick question.
Send it.
Since you've been using OpenSense for a while, and I come
Yeah.
from a PFSense background, has there been any? Have you ran into any times using OpenSense where it wasn't able to do something that you could do in PFSense at all? Oh, okay.
Nope. As
That's
a
good
matter
to
of
hear.
fact, I've found far more functionality in OpenSense than PFSense.
What is your what would you say your like most favorite features out of OpenSense that PFSense doesn't have?
It's not necessarily features that I've used in OpenSense that I haven't used in PFSense, but the ease of using them. So, for instance, as you're well aware, setting up WireGuard can be a little bit of a hassle, with, all the um, keys, et cetera, that you have to switch around. Using it, the plugin for OpenSense is way, way simpler than in PFSense. And generally, in any of the configuration that I've done, has been more straightforward for me on OpenSense than PFSense.
Okay, cool. Yeah, you're selling me pretty good. I might have to make the migration over there.
Yeah, and then in future talks, we'll have to figure out what people are interested in the most. Some of the stuff that interests me is probably going to be setting up like something like WireGuard or showing off like some of the SD-WAN stuff that this can do or something like that. But
Yeah,
other than that, go ahead.
I got one last question, Magos.
What's
And
up,
this
man?
might be a little bit too in depth. I don't have like I have network experience, but as far
Hmm.
as like setting up my home network, so when you basically create that new was it like VLAN
Hmm.
or did you create a VLAN
I,
earlier?
I did I did not know.
It was the network card.
Okay, yeah. Then
Gosh.
other Yep.
Yeah, yeah. So basically, are you like how would you set it up? Like, do you have like one VLAN for like, your gaming rig, one VLAN for your like, home network and things like that? Like I guess what's like the network diagram with um different networks that you would set up?
So you're asking me how I have my network set up?
Yeah, yeah, I guess for like a like a home lab, like how would you set up like your kind of your VLANs? Do you have like different networks at home, like one
Yes.
for, public facing, you don't really care
Yeah.
about. That's like then you have like your DMZ with like
Mhm.
your gaming rig or something like that. Um,
So currently, I'm running it varies between 7 and 11 VLANs at any given time, depending on what I'm doing.
okay.
I have four so my access point, I'm broadcasting four different SSIDs. I have a primary, I have one that I use for IoT, and I have another one I use for all of my wireless video cameras that aren't on PoE, as well as a guest. So all four of those are on their own separate VLANs. On the wired side, I have my DMZ. I have my like general access use, and then I have a trapped sort of container area for naughty VM stuff I do.
Okay, cool. And I guess how would you create like is that all just through like how would you set those up? And you don't have to go into like super detail, but what
Yeah,
page is
so
that in this?
okay, so that would be going into interfaces, other types, VLANs.
VLANs, okay.
It's going to be it's so you're going to be working with two primary pieces of hardware to do that. One is going to be a switch. If you have a managed layer 3 switch, you're going to want to identify what ports are going to what, um, identifying what tags that network traffic has. And then you're going to set up the VLANs as interfaces within OpenSense and setting up firewall rules for that. So it's a multi-stage sort of process to build out a VLAN.
Got it.
Um, I've actually been actively trying in the past couple of days to find some way that I can simulate a switch and like the switch OS like GUI that you would log into to set all of that stuff up on a VM. If anybody knows something like that that I could actually use to demonstrate how to do that, I'd love to teach you how to, but it's kind of hard to do, and I'm not going to show you guys my actual network.
Yeah, yeah, no worries. Yeah, yeah, you don't have to do that. I was just curious because when I worked at one of the universities, like I never configured a switch. I wasn't on that networking team to do it.
Yep.
So they would always get like, oh, hey, let's configure the switch, and they had like a full process to set up like all the different VLANs and things like that, and breaking it
Yep.
down. So I was just curious, like, what that process is for a home network, because yeah, I don't have
It
a
it is
firewall, unfortunately. So
it's going to be somewhat hardware specific. So every manufacturer is going to have their own firmware and GUI setup process. Most of them are fairly similar, but there's always going to be quirks from manufacturer to manufacturer. Um, but
like
the
Ubiquiti
process more or
versus
less is
Cisco,
going to be, I'm sorry?
like Ubiquiti versus like a Cisco switch.
Yeah, versus TP Link or, whatever you're using.
Yeah. Okay.
But basically, it's essentially, you're going to go in and there's going to be an interface, right? And it's going to have all of your different ports, okay? And then you're like, okay, port number one, that's attached to something that I want to have a VLAN. And if it's not a smart endpoint, so like a enterprise access point that can have defined VLANs on itself is a whole different other story. But generally speaking, let's say I want computer one to be on VLAN one. Well, then I would tell it, okay, all traffic coming out of that port is going to have tag one. And then you're going to come over to your router, which OPNSense is your router software, and configure that within here. So as I said, it's kind of a multi-stage, multi-hardware configuration.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for the brief walkthrough.
Yep.
And Magos, if you don't mind, I'll kind of put a note out too for anybody that's interested in building out their own home router, using OPNSense or PFSense. All you need is a few very inexpensive things. You need
100%.
You could use an old desktop. That's probably the best way to do it. You can get like a $15 to $20 TP-Link gigabit network switch off Amazon. I can share a link if you're interested. If you want to just go on the cheap, that way you have two NICs. You'll have the built-in network interface that your system will have, part of the motherboard, and then this other secondary one would be like a PCI network interface. That will give you two, one for the WAN, one for the LAN, and then that only gives you two ports. So you can pick up either a inexpensive like TP-Link, for example, managed switch, or a unmanaged switch for anywhere from like $15 to $20 on Amazon. And at that point, you could you can almost practically throw away your old router. The only thing is how you're gonna get wireless. And one cool feature is you could, a lot of these Asus, these Nighthawk routers, or almost all the different brands will allow you to put your home router into a mode called AP mode, access point mode, and you can just have your old dumb router acting just as an access point for wireless. And that way you put all the brains into OPNSense, PFSense on this old PC. You still have your Nighthawk or whatever Asus router you're using, whatever brand it is, as your wireless access point. And then you can plug in all your other systems into the network switch. And then you got your own, really state-of-the-art, highly secure system that, supports VLANs and things like that. So it's food for thought.
Yep. As a matter of fact, for anybody who's interested in doing that, I will drop a note into general later with some information about it. But I was previously, if anybody's familiar with what a Protectly is, it's like a NUC, like a small computer, totally passively cooled. And I was originally using that as my edge device. And I have no need for it any longer since I've upgraded. But I'll drop a note in general later with some info about it. And if anybody wants it, let me know, and I'll just send it to them for free.
Cool. Appreciate it, man. Well, we'll wrap it up. I'm going to stop the recording.